Daniel chapter 1, we're going to be looking this morning at verses 3 through 21. We're going to go through the end of the chapter. It's been a couple of weeks. It's good to see everybody, and it's good to be back. I want to say a couple of things just at the beginning of the service. First of all, doesn't the Christmas decorations look great? They look awesome. Miss Pat was here yesterday with her family helping put this together, and they did a fantastic job. If we can't meet up the hill, we're going to at least transform this, make it look like Christmas down here. So I think they did a wonderful job. It looks really amazing. So I want to say thank you to them. Thank you for praying for our family. We did fine. We're pretty much all good. Want to clarify, only part of my family's here this morning. Just my youngest. It's weird how they do things. The one that tests positive only gets about 10 days of quarantine, and the ones in the house get about 24 days of quarantine. And so the rest of my family can't go back to school and all of that until sometime in December. So they're not here with us this morning. They better be watching. I hope they're watching at home right now. If you are, hey, guys, good to see you. So thank you for praying for us. Everybody is good. Everybody feels pretty much 100%. So it's so good to be back this week, and we need to jump in because got a lot of verses to cover, a lot of stuff to cover today. But thank you for being here, and I'm excited to be back in the Word of God this morning. It's been about 3 weeks since I preached, so hopefully I'll hold up and you won't get all my reserve words today too, so we can get out on time. But we'll be in Daniel chapter 1, looking at 3 through 24, and we left off. I'm just going to jump right in. There's no possible way I could recap from 3 weeks ago what we talked about, but we left off with God giving Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And why did that happen? What was it that led to that? Well, we said it was the result, it was the consequence of a very, very long time of God's people ignoring God. They had ignored His word. They had ignored listening to Him and refused to hear Him. And so at the end of a long time, He had given them many, many, many chances to listen to Him and to respond to Him. Finally, they forced His hand, and He gave them over into the first of really what became 3 stages of exile for the people of Judah and the people of Israel. And Nebuchadnezzar does, we'll see this today, he does 2 things right from the beginning. When he takes over, when he conquers the Assyrians, when he begins to take over the whole entirety of the Middle East, he does 2 things. The first of them you see in verse 2. Down at the end of verse 2, it said that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, we already said that, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels into the treasury of his God. So the very first thing that Nebuchadnezzar does when he takes over Judah is he loots the temple. That's the first thing he does. And Daniel is not telling us just that Judah got robbed. He's not just trying to tell us that the temple got robbed and looted. He's trying to tell us that Nebuchadnezzar, in doing this, is making a very powerful statement. And if you don't hear what he's saying, what Nebuchadnezzar is telling Judah is, my God beat your God. That's the significance of it. That's the significance of robbing the temple and carrying the stuff from the temple off and putting it in his God's temple. He's saying, my God beat your God. My God's more powerful than your God. My God's stronger than your God. Your God is just a servant in my God's house. That's the point. He's gloating over them. He's rubbing it in. He's like an obnoxious football fan after their team just beat your team. That's what he's doing. He's demoralizing the people of Judah. It's a very powerful psychological and spiritual weapon that he forms against them. He's demoralizing them. And then the second thing he does is just as demoralizing as the first thing. The second thing you see in verse 3, Nebuchadnezzar says, then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility. Who are these people? Verse 4 says youths. We'll explore that in a minute. Bring some of these people. It sounds a lot nicer than it actually was. It says he commanded them to bring. What does that mean? Well, it means to kidnap them. That's essentially what he's saying. Kidnap them, rip them away from their families. That's what this was. Can you imagine being the parents after you've just been defeated? Can you imagine having your young people ripped away from you and taken to a foreign land? Daniel and his friends were probably about 15 right here. I have a daughter. My oldest daughter is turning 15 on Tuesday. And I cannot imagine having my daughter ripped away from me and carried off to a foreign land. Now, why did he do that? What's the significance of this act? The first thing is looting the temple, saying, my God beat your God. Why did he rip away these youth from their families? Well, this is part of Nebuchadnezzar's long-term plan to rule Judah. All right? In the short term, you send your military in and you conquer the people and you defeat them and you kill people. That's the short-term plan, but that's not the long-term plan, because the long-term plan, you don't want all the people dead, you want them working for you. And the best way to get them to work for you is to transform their culture. That's what I want you to see. To see a cultural transformation. See, Babylon's not trying to destroy Judah. They're trying to change them. To get them to conform. To get them to look just like they do. And how do they do that? They do it by starting with the youth. They start with the youth. And it's not just any youth, but look at what verse 4 says about these young people. It says that these were youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them. We'll get into that in just a minute. So this is the cream of the crop. These are the royal youth. These are the nobility. They're very smart. They're very good looking. This is important, they're very influential. This would have been all of the very famous YouTubers and the very famous TikTok people, the ones that had the most followers on Instagram, or back in Daniel's day, it would have been the Facebookers, the ones that had a lot of Facebook followers. That's who these people were. They're people that could be trained because they're brilliant, and they can then go back and influence the people to become like Babylon. And this is so important for you to understand. See, if you want to transform a culture, you don't start with the old people. All right? I love old people. I've said that before. I feel older. I just turned 43 while I was on quarantine. I had a birthday at the house, just hanging out at my house. But you don't start with the old people. Why not? Old people are pretty hard to change, right? I mean, they have a reputation that's well-earned for being sort of set in their ways. You could say that as you get older, your clay starts to harden a little bit, right? You're a whole lot less able to be molded. And sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's bad. Let's be honest. Sometimes it's bad for your clay to get hardened, because sometimes that might keep you from making good changes. Some of you who are older, and I'll put myself in there, even though I still feel young. You know, sometimes we get a little too stuck in our ways. Sometimes we get a little too resistant to make changes and do things that might be good for us and healthy for us and helpful for us. Things that might help us to grow physically and mentally and spiritually, those kinds of things. How many of you, when you were younger, got irritated with your parents or with your grandparents because they were stuck in their ways? Like, when are you going to get with it? When are you going to do? When are you going to make some changes? But sometimes it's very good, because sometimes that hardenedness is a hardenedness about your convictions and about your beliefs and about what's right and about what's wrong. So sometimes it's very good. So you start then, not with the old people, you start with the young. Why? Not just because old people are hard to change, but because young people are easier to change. Younger people are very easy to be molded. Their clay hasn't hardened quite as much. They're not as developed yet. They're more susceptible to introducing new things, more susceptible to changing things. So how do you then mold the youth so that you transform them, and then in doing that, go and transform the culture? Well, you see two things here in the text. You have to isolate them and then indoctrinate them. That's the plan. You isolate them from all of their old influences, all of their good influences, and then you indoctrinate them with your influences. So notice what they do. They isolate them. Notice how they're isolated. Where are they educated? They're not left in Judah. They're not left in their home, but they're taken from home. They're taken a couple of 100 miles away to the land of Shinar, to Babylon. They're taken away from their families. They're away from their parents. They're away from their grandparents. They're away from their teachers. They're away from their religious leaders. All of their influences now are new influences. All of their new influences are Babylonian influences. And so what does that do? That serves to undermine their raising. Undermine the way they were raised. You get them in this place of isolation, away from the past, away from what they grew up with. You isolate them away from that so that you undermine the way that they were brought up. Get them to doubt their upbringing. Get them to doubt their parents' wisdom. Get them to doubt the wisdom their grandparents passed on down to them. Doubting the morality that they grew up with. Doubting their God. Doubting their identity. They're tearing down the past so that they can build up this different future. It's a very smart plan, but it's an evil plan. So once they've got them sufficiently isolated, then they move on to the indoctrination stage. So that's next. Get them away from the past and then indoctrinate them. Look at the end of verse 4. Verse 4 says, these are youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. And to do what? And to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So here's our introduction to these young men. There's 4 of them named, Daniel and his 3 friends. And this, verse 4 through 7, describes for you the process of indoctrination, whereby they would become good Babylonians. This is how they'd be transformed to become good Babylonians so that they could go and then spread the good news of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar everywhere they went. So there's 4 parts to this indoctrination. These are the 4 stages of it. They were, it was a new religion they learned, a new language that they learned. They had a new diet, and they had new names. All right, so religion, language, diet, and names. So they had to be taught, verse 4 says, the literature of the Chaldeans. This is talking about the Babylonian religion. And I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail to describe it, but Babylonian religion was all centered on astrology and magic and communication with the dead and sorcery and witchcraft. And you see all those things in the book of Daniel, but this was the Chaldean religion, and so they had to lose their old religion and learn this new religion. But it wasn't just the religion, they had to learn a new language. They didn't want them speaking the language from their home. They didn't want them to identify any longer with their homeland, and part of that involved learning a new language. They had to learn the language of the Chaldeans. See, if you don't know this about Israel, the people of ancient Israel spoke Hebrew. That was their language. And from starting about this same time, somewhere around this same time as the exile, the people of Israel began speaking a different language. And do you know that Hebrew was not the official language of the people of Israel and Jews until about the end of the 1900s, or into the 1800s, into the 1900s? And then when Israel was reformed in 1948, I believe, they adopted the language of Hebrew as their official language. But it went dormant, essentially. It was just a spiritual language. It was kind of like Latin. It wasn't spoken anymore. It was just written. So they had to learn a new language. Then verse 5 says they're given a new diet. Now, I don't know what this was exactly. I don't know what the diet was, but the word there for food means rich delicacies. These are like the tastiest little treats, all right? This is not Laura Lynn. None of this was Laura Lynn. None of this was generic. Nobody was drinking Spritz Up. Nobody was drinking Dr. Thunder. Nobody was eating Laura Lynn ice cream. It was all the name brand stuff. It was all the best stuff. It was all the richest foods. It was the same food that the king ate and the same wine that the king drank. So the point is, woo them with these fine things. Woo them with a finer diet from the king. They got all the best stuff. They probably got all the newest iPhones. They got the newest PlayStation. You make them think, look, we're so special that we only get the best stuff here. They're really investing in us. And that'll kind of help us forget where we came from. If we get all the good stuff, then we'll sort of forget what we left behind. And then last of all, verse 6, it says they got new names. So this is the end of the whole thing. It's a whole new identity. Their old names were all associated not just with their home, but with their God. All of these names that you see, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, all of those are associated with Israel's God, Yahweh. So they had to have new names that were associated with their new gods. And so at the end of the day, what's going on is this was about a 3-year training process to completely erase their old identity and give them new identities as good Babylonians. It's kind of like college. Doesn't that feel kind of like what college is? College is meant to isolate you away from your family and all of your old influences and give you a whole new identity. So that's kind of what it was. It was college in Babylon to help them become good, faithful Babylonians. That's a lot of trouble for some teenagers, isn't it? Isn't that a lot of trouble they went through? Why did they do all that? What does that tell you? It tells you how important it is to capture the hearts and the minds of the young. That's how important it is, that they went through all this trouble to capture the hearts and the minds of the young. And I want to challenge you this morning, do not be blind to the fact that that is still happening right now. That is still the enemy plan. It's the exact same thing. Capture the hearts and the minds of the young. And I don't think I even need to give you examples for you to know that the enemy is still doing that. He's still trying to capture the hearts and the minds of your kids, of your grandkids. Because it's the same principle. It's the same principle then as it is now. And it's this: if you win the young, you win the future. If you win the hearts and the minds of the young, you win the future. Do not be blind to this. Don't be blind to it. That is why it is so important for us as a church, for you in your homes and in your families, to invest in your children. Train them to love the Lord. Train them in the Word of God. We'll see why that's so important. Teach them to love Jesus. Teach them to be devoted to Jesus. Model that for them. Set that example for them. Teach them. We're going to talk about idolatry. Teach them there's no God but our God. It's not just for today. It's for 70 years from today. That's why, as a church, we invest in the future. We love all ages. But we want to invest in the future. That's why we voted to build the playground out here last week, which I'm very glad we did. It's going to be awesome. But it's not just about giving them something to play with. It's about training them in the principles of Scripture so that they can go out in the midst of Babylon and remain steadfast and faithful. The enemy understands that. They can play the long game. You're right. It doesn't have to all happen at once. It can happen over time. I hope we do as well. So here you have Daniel, you have his friends. Again, he's probably 15 years old. He's far away, hundreds of miles away from home. He's isolated from everything that he knew growing up. He's indoctrinated with these new teachings, these exciting things. He's given the best of the best stuff. How do you think you would have responded if that were you? How do you think your child, my 15-year-old, how do you think they would respond in that setting? Would you give in? Wouldn't that be the easy thing to do? Wouldn't that be the easiest thing in the world to do? When every social media post, when all of the culture, it's all pushing you in one direction. It's pushing you to conform to us. Babylon won, our God won, you lost, your God lost. Embrace it. Just embrace Babylon. Embrace the new religion. Embrace the new language. Embrace the new diet. Embrace your new names. Embrace your new identity. Isn't the easiest thing in the world just to go, okay, I give up. I'm going to take it all. I'll eat the food. I'll take the name. I'll take the religion. I'll do it all. That's what a lot of people would have done in that situation. But that's not Daniel's story. That's not the story we're going to see. Daniel's the story of somebody that resisted, refused to be like Babylon. It's the story of somebody who stayed faithful even when it was difficult, and it got very difficult. You know the stories. We're going to look at them. But it's also the story about how God vindicated his people. That he'd sent them to Babylon, he'd sent them to exile, but he didn't send them there to leave them there. He was eventually going to vindicate them. He was eventually going to rescue them. And we'll see those hints of that all throughout the first 6 chapters of this book. But right here in chapter 1, you see the foundation of the next 70 years of steadfastness. This foundation of Daniel's steadfastness in exile. Daniel lived in Babylon for 70 years, probably 70 years. He lived longer in Babylon than he ever lived in Judah. But you know what? His heart never left home. His heart never left his God. And what I really want you to see this morning is that everything that happened over the next 70 years of his life was already settled right here at the beginning. How Daniel finished his life in exile was determined even at the earliest stage, even at the beginning of his exile. But I don't want you to just see this for Daniel. I want you to see this for you. I want you to see this in your life. How you finish your life, you're settling that right now. Where you're going to be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years, in 75 years. All of that's being settled right now. It's being settled. And there's 3 things that we see Daniel here right from the beginning do. That if you do these things, you will notice that they will set the course for your life, wherever you are. It's never too late to change. It's harder to change. If you're 85, it's harder to change than it is if you're 15. It's harder. But wherever you are, and however much time you have left, let's look at what Daniel does here. Right from the beginning. Remember, this early chapter here, chapter 1, Daniel's about 15 years old. It's amazing. 15 to 17, 18 years old by the end of the chapter. This just amazes me. 3 things. Number 1, resolve to be faithful. Resolve to be faithful. Resolve right now, today, not tomorrow, not next week, today. Resolve to be faithful. Look at verse 8. Verse 8 says, but Daniel, there's the word, resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. So I don't know if Daniel knew this. I doubt that he did know this. But he had just passed 3 huge tests right here. A lot of people wonder why exactly it was that Daniel refused to eat the king's food and drink the king's wine. There's no real reason given here. It doesn't tell us why he did it. Some people think it was because the food was unclean and Daniel wanted to continue to follow the Old Testament dietary laws. Some people think maybe the food was sacrificed to idols and that Daniel didn't want to eat food that was sacrificed to idols. It doesn't tell us. All it tells us really is that if he ate it, he would have been defiled. That word defiled means to be made morally unclean. So whatever it was, the first test here was a moral test. This was a moral issue and a moral test that Daniel passed. But it wasn't just a moral test, it was also a test of Daniel's allegiance. It was an allegiance test. If he had taken the food that the king offered and the wine that the king offered, he'd be saying, in effect, I'll be like you. I'll be on your side. I'll be on your team. If I eat the food that you eat, if I eat from your table, then I'm aligning myself with you. I'm siding with the king. So it would have been an act of conformity. I always want us to conform. So it's interesting. This is the issue that Daniel chose to take a stand on. Because Daniel learned the language, Daniel learned about the religion, Daniel apparently had accepted the name change, but he wasn't eating the food. He wasn't eating the food. And what does that tell me? It tells me that there's a line that we have to draw that we cannot cross. There's a line that you have to draw in the sand that if you cross over, it takes you from being in the culture to being of the culture. And Daniel refused to cross that line. He refused to cross the line from being in the culture to being of the culture. He says right here, I'm with God. I'm maintaining my allegiance to God. So let me ask you this morning, where's your line? What's the line that you've drawn that you will not cross no matter what pressure is put on you? No matter what consequence may come your way. What is the line that you refuse to ever cross? Some of you are like, I don't know, I don't really have a line. Draw it. You need to draw the line. Draw the line. Take your stand on the side of faithfulness. This is not just a test. Not just a moral test. This is not just a test of allegiance, but third, it was a test of his will. It was a test of Daniel's will. That word resolve means to determine. Some of the old translations say he purposed in his heart. And what that means is it was already, and this is so important. You need to hear if you checked out for a minute. Daniel had settled in his heart already who he was and whose side he was on before the test ever came. Before the test came. Not after, not in the moment. He didn't just decide right in that moment what he was going to do. And I bet you already know this, but if you wait until the test comes your way to decide what you're going to do, it's already too late. You don't decide when the test comes. You don't decide after the test is there already. It's too late by then. And so many times, I bet this is true in your life, so many times we fall for just this reason. Because we've not settled in our hearts already. We've not resolved in our hearts already what line we're going to refuse to cross over. So see, understand, it starts in your heart long before it ever gets to the test. O.S. Hawkins said Daniel had predetermined which way he was going to turn long before he got to the intersection. Have you? You're going to come to a lot of intersections in your life, and many of you have already come to a lot of intersections in your life. And I want to challenge you today, decide now. Purpose in your heart now. Resolve now which way you're going to turn before you come to the intersection. Before you even get there, decide. And when you do that, this is awesome. When you do that, that makes all the rest of your decisions very easy. When you already know which way you're going to turn before you ever get there, your decisions then become easy. From a moral perspective, they become very easy. You'll notice that about Daniel and his friends. What to do from that point until 70 years from now was never in question. It was always going to be very simple for him. Will this honor God? If so, I'll do it. Will this dishonor God and defile me? If so, I'll never do it. So number one, resolve. Number two, revere. Revere God, not the king. Look at verse 10. Verse 10 says, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my Lord the King. I underlined that twice in my Bible. I fear my Lord the King, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter. The first guy didn't listen. The second guy did listen. He listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Listen, everybody has someone that they fear. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you say. Everyone fears someone. And the person that you fear the most is the person that controls you. You hear that? The person you fear the most is the person who controls you. Right here, the chief eunuch tells us who he fears the most. And he shows us. He said, I fear my Lord, the king. And we can knock him, but let's be honest. His life was in the king's hands. He told Daniel, you would endanger my head with the king. So the man couldn't listen to Daniel, and the man couldn't listen to God because he was controlled by his fear of the king. So what about Daniel? Who did Daniel fear? Let me ask you this. Do you think Daniel's life was in the hands of the king too? Think about that. Was Daniel's life in the hands of the king, King Nebuchadnezzar? From a human perspective, yes, it was, right? If Nebuchadnezzar would have ordered it, Daniel could have had his head chopped off just like anybody else. He could have been executed just like anybody else. He could have been thrown in the fiery furnace. We'll see he is. He could have been thrown in the den of the lions. He could have been put in prison. Absolutely. From a human perspective, his life was in the hands of the king. So why did that not bother Daniel when it bothered the chief eunuch? Well, it didn't bother Daniel because he understood something that the eunuch didn't understand, and something that you should understand too. And that is, if you fear God, you don't have to fear man. If you fear God most, you don't have to be afraid of man. Proverbs 29:25 says this, the fear of man lays a snare. Your fear of man will trap you. It will snare you. It will catch you. And it will control you. It'll control your life. You will be ruled by your fear of man. But the second part of the verse says, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. I love this. See, we escape the trap. We escape the control. We escape the snare of the fear of man, not by having no fear, but by having the right fear. I was listening the other day to an interview from what I consider to be one of the world's most prominent theologians, Kanye West. Some of you may know him. I know he says some crazy things and does some crazy things from time to time. I'm not sure I would tell my kids, be like him. But I was listening to the interview, and he claims to be a follower of Christ, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He makes some strong claims to be a follower of Christ. And what he said in this interview is absolute truth. Listen to what he said. He said, when you remove, even in the schools, you remove prayer, you remove God, you remove the fear of God, you create the possibility of the fear of everything else. But watch this. When you instill the fear of God, you eliminate the fear of anything else. And it's not that I'm fearless. I love this. It's not that I'm fearless. I am definitely, literally, definitely shaking and in so much fear of my Father. I fear God, and I don't fear nothing else, is what he said. That's truth. There's so much that you can learn from Daniel's courage and Daniel's fear. So your fear can make you a coward, or it can make you courageous. And Daniel's fear made him courageous in Babylon. And so will yours. So will yours. Your fear, your well-placed fear in the right person will alter the course of your life. The course of your life is going to be set by who you fear the most. Because remember, who you fear most is who controls you. Who you fear most is who controls you. So who do you fear? Who's the one you are controlled by? Who are you controlled by? Number one, resolve to be faithful. Number two, revere God, fear God, not the king. And then number three, receive God's empowerment. Receive God's empowerment. Verse 17, as for these four youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better, not just a little bit better, but 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. I want to zero in, because we don't have time to look in detail. Just one little word, one little phrase there in verse 17, that God gave. God gave. God gave Daniel and his friends the empowerment that they needed. And you're really going to see this next part next week, so I'm not going to, again, focus too much on it. You're going to see how important this is and why it matters here. But today I just want to focus on that. God gave. Because you see that phrase show up, I don't know how many times in chapter 1. God gave. God gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. God gave, God gave, God gave. God gave his people into exile, but he didn't leave them there to fend for themselves. No, God gave them everything they were going to need to serve his purposes for them in Babylon. God had purposes for Daniel and his three friends in Babylon. He had a purpose for them that they were to carry out while they were in the midst of this exile. And understand this, God has a purpose for you to carry out in whatever place you find yourself in. Again, we're going to look at this next week. But God has a purpose for us in Babylon. And if he has a purpose for you and a purpose for me that he wants us to carry out, then he's going to give us the power that we need. He's going to give us the strength that we need. He's going to give us the gifts that we need to carry that out. And our job is to receive the empowerment from God. And how do we do that? How do we receive it? Well, notice the order here. It says he gave them the gifts. He blessed them with the favor in the sight of the king after they had resolved in their hearts to be faithful to God first, after they demonstrated that they feared God above all else, more than they feared the king. Then God goes, okay, here is the wisdom that you need. Here is the insight that you need. Here's the special gifts that you need. Here's what you're going to need for the rest of your time in exile. That's why we start here. Start with your resolve for faithfulness. Start with your fear of God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Start there. And then receive the empowerment you need, the gifts that you need from God to carry out the purpose he has for you, wherever you find yourself. Verse 21 says, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. That's 70 years. 70 years, all captured in this one little verse. One translation said, Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus. He continued. You can't continue what you haven't started. This is the foundation. This is how it begins. We're going to see where it ends. But where's it end for you? How's it going to end for you? What's 70 years look like for you? Some of you, 70 years you'll be in heaven. What's 7 years look like for you? What's 15 years from now look like for you? However long you have left, how's it going to end? I want to go back to this again. However it ends, you're settling it right now. You're settling it now. Where's your resolve? Are you resolved to faithfulness to God? Have you purposed it in your heart? Have you decided which way you're going to turn before you ever get there? Where's your fear? Who do you fear the most? That's who controls you. Do you fear God? Do you fear the king? Do you fear the president? Do you fear your spouse? Do you fear your friend? Do you fear your boss? Who is it you fear the most? Are you ready to receive the gift that God has for you? It starts with a free gift of eternal life found in Jesus and Jesus alone. Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. Jesus came to this earth, lived a perfect life, died on the cross, a death that we deserve in our place for our sins. But he was raised from the dead on the third day that we might have eternal life. That's really where it starts. Have you trusted in Christ for your salvation, for your life?